So the question is, how do we become endlessly fluent, endlessly creative? How do we just eliminate the creative blockages, right? So what Jerome and I have been studying is essentially if we can break the creative blockages in real time, then that means that we can create endlessly, right? That's where the abundance of creation comes from. It's just the ability to get over any of the creative blockages that would occur in real time, because the implications of that, that's the whole point of everything. That's the whole deep conversation. It's just that what stops you from improvising in real time? You know what I'm saying, right? That's what we're driving at. What stops the flow state, right? What stops the flow state? Because the flow state is micro, macro, everywhere in between on all the spectrums. But it seems like almost like it might be some alchemical secret that if you can unlock the real time creation and understand the mindset of what that means, you know what I mean? Because it's not as simple as just being like, oh, hey, improvise. There's a whole like ladder of, you know, building blocks before you actually can improvise. Like what true improvisational fluency would be different than maybe being confined to a very small vocabulary where it's not possible to expand based on like incoming, you know, data, whether that's real-time incoming data or, you know, macro study listening data. Like we're talking about the idea of building a technique around an expansive vocabulary, right? Building a technique that is facilitating a constantly expanding vocabulary. That on its own seems like an impossible, you know, that seems so intimidating. I mean, for me personally, that seems intimidating from the perspective that I had, you know, 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, I didn't understand how to unlock the limitless technique with regards to an expanding vocabulary and what that means. So I was like hung up on the idea of like all the physical little chop things that need to happen and all this kind of stuff, like this really small minutia. But then what I realized is that there's all these people who have all these chops and still can't improvise. So it's not actually about the chops, right? There's a whole other deeper level with it, which is that's what we're driving at, is like what does that mentality of improvisation really mean? And it connects to a limitless technique from the perspective of you're the one creating the vocabulary, so your technique is just going to adapt to the vocabulary that you create, right? So it's not like there's like a be all end all technique. It's like, well, what do you play, right? So then if you come it from like classical, you know, if you come it from that classical mentality, it's you have so much technique that you don't even know what to grab onto. You have unlimited, relentless, unending technique. You could play anything, but that full circles right back to be able to play nothing, right? So then we have to go down to those first principle components and understand what those are in terms of improvisation, right? And that's where we start to see the mentality of improvisation emerge, right? Mentality of improvisation being sequencing components, okay? Sequencing components, identifying the components and sequencing them and having a little bit of a larger view of what's going on, right? You're not literally choosing one note at a time. And maybe that's what a lot of people think improvisation is a lot of the times, is that you're picking one note at a time. And that's like, that's impossible, right? You can't, how can you do, you're more thinking of like multiple components at a time. And you're through practice and study, you're seeing how one component would connect to another component and the sequence of events implied by taking one component and going in one direction with it, right? This whole thing, mentality of improvisation, right? Okay, so am I making sense? Any questions so far? Or any comments, insights?
Yeah, I have one, but maybe
Perfect.
Jerome has something if you would like to say first.
No, all you.
Go for it.
Okay, so what I'm thinking of is that uh, I have practiced some improvisation, you know, and I can vaguely understand what you mean by having moments of like some kind of breakthrough. where you can just somehow play more extensively, and it just makes sense on the spot, and you can just somehow naturally express this. But how to exactly define it, it's very, very hard. But if I ever have to improvise right now, because my language is very limited, uh, uh, it is very important that what I play sounds contextually right. So it's like close to the chord tones and in the melodies that are in the scales, and I have some kind of specific thing I would like to express melodically. Like for example, if I have a specific harmony, like two chords that are in two different modes or whatever, then I will try to kind of differentiate those tonal centers by the phrases or whatever tension I would like to apply, you know, whether to outline or just to have like a fifth or fourth drive through to like sound as close as possible and kind of connect them or whatever. But I would realistically right now, I would just learn I have some kind of chord progression. I would learn some kind of caged arpeggios, learn a few scales. For example, what are the major position in this particular fret position that I'm playing? What is the Litz melodic minor there? And what is, for example, harmonic minor or whole tone or diminished or whatever? And I would just learn these few positions as well as scales, as well as those caged, just few arpeggios, and then I would just use this to have like a net that I can't fall off, and always have something to catch on and to stimulate that moment of, I don't know, creativity or
Well said,
improvisation.
man. That's
And
awesome.
basically, yeah. And of course, there are rhythmic aspects you can focus on. There are like expression, anything, and it could be as minimalistic as you would like to, or as shred as you would like to have, whatever. But yeah, and then for example, what I would do, I would just have a take on take. Just I would record something, and I would record, for example, my best idea or solo, something like that, and
Mhm.
then that becomes viable, or as it is, or as for something else to compose on, and
Mhm.
yeah. But it's the very essence of that is very hard to explain.
Oh yeah.
That you had just connect, and you can just
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and it
But
also yeah,
you're
yeah,
identifying the level of components as well. Like you're talking about like caged, for
yes,
example. Caged, if that works as the, component grip thing for your arpeggio framework, that's in
yeah.
line with that's in line with the triadic thing, right? Because you can technically use any intervallic shape you want.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would like to emphasize the rhythm very much because I
Mhm.
like Frederick Stordenthal's playing, for example. Like he likes
Yep.
to do this, or like all these smaller rhythms that he likes to do in phrases,
Hmm.
and that he likes to be very specific. And maybe he will make a large interval, like a major seventh or minor seventh somewhere, and then he will go back to like the root,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, like focusing on
But
an
especially
interval.
rhythm, I would like to emphasize the rhythm. He has a very interesting, and of course, a lot of other people, but especially Frederick Dordenthal. Yeah, I really like to improv with his style of rhythm, and it just doesn't sound like jazz per se. It just sounds
Exactly.
like something fusion or something, some kind of new. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say it's working with like a lot of times with Thorndahl, he's working with the smallest components possible, which end up sometimes just being literally one interval, right? It's just like one interval with the rhythm. And it's just like that's the point of the whole thing we're driving at here is like, well, if you can improvise with one singular
Yeah.
interval because of your rhythmic awareness, I mean, you know what I mean? Like that's definitely
Yeah.
an infinite rabbit hole
Yeah.
right there, of course.
But I would just finish with small. Just I would like to emphasize that the rhythmic blocks, it's just as vast, if not more, as the harmonic part of it.
That's what Jerome was saying too. He's talking about
Yeah.
using rhythmic grips also instead of just we're talking about grips, go for it.
Well, I was just gonna say it's interesting you use the word, especially for Frederick's playing, that there's like this new sound, and it's funny because I wrote to him and asked him just like what was he thinking about when writing his kaleidoscope solo, because it's so interesting harmonically and rhythmically the way that he's like cycling through. And it's his thing was just like, oh, I really have no idea, man. I was just trying to like come up with something that I'd never really heard before, like something out of his own perception.
Great, great. Yeah, that's
Yes, I
always
think that's a
helpful.
good point of improvisation. I'm sorry.
Oh, go for it. It's good.
Uh, I wanted to say, it's, you know, uh, the aim of hearing something new is a good stimuli for like bass improvisation or something
Beautiful.
like that. That it will, I think it helps. I think it really helps yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
I remember citing Blake that he told that if he would do it, like I think it was in 2019 or something, but he had a lesson and he literally told me that if I would have to relearn like how to improvise, like no, like right now, he would just like set a metronome to like 60 or something, and he would just practice specific notes of the scale, just pick one note and just listen, pick another note and listen, and just try it for different like melodic, like intervallic and or rhythmic, these combinations, and then he would have a different perspective and different base, some kind of vocabulary which he would use. And I assume Frederick also did this, so from a lot of experience, probably, yeah, and that's how it happened, probably.
There's definitely that idea of literally getting familiar with like interval and like chord tones relative or just notes relative to bass notes like that. I think that's what I was driving at with that, which is definitely something I did before I even understood the implications of rhythm, because I was thinking that all of the material I needed was more in understanding like harmony and melody. And there's definitely, there is that aspect, but now what I've realized is that it's easy or relatively easy to become completely fluent in harmony as the 12 tone system goes. And then of course, like with you, Armin, you're doing even more tone systems than 12, but just to master the 12 tone system is like not like the hardest thing in the world, right? It's like I would say it's easier to do that than it is to learn the English language. But then to actually, wield that's a whole, like, wield it with real time creation, and also just, no creative blockages, like no real time
Mhm.
blockages, no macro blockages. That's a result of actually understanding how to put those pieces together in the 12 tone
Uh,
system, which is different than just understanding it and be able to explain it, you know.
what I can tell you could be a productive discussion is that I cannot tell you what the answer is to like musical fluency, but I can
Mm.
tell you how to stimulate it.
That is,
I can
you
tell you
said that,
some
yeah.
ideas. Yeah, yeah, that how to stimulate it. For example, one thing be with, on guitar, for example, you have ability to slide, and you can introduce this ability to slide from a different scale degrees, or have a specific lick, or just try to use it within improvisation, and then naturally somehow your subconscious will drive you to create those licks, and you will hear something that's out of the usual playing that you do, if you don't use the sliding, and then you would have this moment of yeah, some kind of uh, like immediate response or inspiration, and
Yeah.
just like that you can focus on, as a previous example from Frederick, you can focus on rhythm, you can focus on a specific interval, let's say like tritone or some other interval, to accent that interval, or dynamics, or even pick a different tone or something, and that will also like change the parameter of your subconscious, like how it's regularly done, or yeah, something like that.
Yeah, to stimulate it for sure. I think that's a really good perspective, because that's kind of how um I've been thinking about it more lately, is like, so you're, if you come at it from this perspective of flow state, right? Stimulating the flow state, go like deeper into the flow state, right? Like, what are you stimulating? You're kind of stimulating that state of mind that sees all the opportunities and possibilities, and has the technique, whatever that really means, to sort of like navigate through real time, with that like swift, like warrior mentality, like don't die. But then you also realize that you can't even die, right, in music. And that's what's powerful, is the moment you realize there's no mistakes in music, and what that actually means. There's literally, like, it means you can't die, but it means that you have to interpret all the musical stimulations in a way that you understand them, right? You have to interpret. So like the classic for me, right, speaking from my perspective, is like playing a lot of jazz with people. What the problem is in the real time, what can lose the flow is when people start doing things that are displacing, the time, right? It's just displacing the form, displacing the time. When people start doing displacements, and that means infinite number of things. That can mean groups of 7 over 4. That can mean groups of 13 over 4. It's just like, it means so many different things. But displacements are that thing that can sort of like pull you out of the flow state because you start to doubt where the form is or what the actual true harmonic sequence is, right? So that thing pulling you out of the flow state is one of those moments where it's just like, well, if you were absolutely convicted, right, in where the form is, regardless of all the displacements and things that can happen in real-time improvisation, well, then guess what? You know what I mean? Like, you literally can't die, because if you say make a mistake, it's not, the only thing that would make it a mistake is if you didn't see how it related to what else was going on. And on the basic level, like the first foundation of what I mean by what is going on, that's the form that's implied by the musicians that you're playing with. So if you're playing by yourself, for example, you're implying a form. Theoretically, as long as the form doesn't die, there are no mistakes, right? And even if you do make a mistake, it doesn't mean that the form has died. It just means that you now have to corroborate what you may be identifying as a mistake, right? And so it's like, when I say mistake, I'm talking about like judging the moment, right? So inner critic coming up here, it's like there's no mistakes, so there's no inner critic, right? So it's like, what is a mistake? It's a wrong language. It's just about understanding how some musical decision fits into the fundamental map, the fundamental schematic, the fundamental form of what's going on. Map, schematic, form, harmonic sequence, harmonic rhythm, all these things. If you are bulletproof on what that is, then even with displacements, you can hear all the displacements relative to the form, and they, in a way, they enforce it, right? But only once you've gone through the process of seeing how displacements work and understanding what people do with forms, right? So you got like a simple little form, like what do people do with the simple little form? What makes it like infinitely complex? And I'm trying to identify what that really is using this word displacements, because I think that's actually one major aspect of it that's been going on like since like jazz improvisation, but then turning into the whole level of displacements where you're getting into like Meshuggah type displacements, where you have groups of numbers moving incrementally against other groups of numbers. That is like systematic displacement, compositional displacement. But I think a lot of displacement came from like Elvin Jones playing on beat 3 and making it sound like it was beat 1. You know what I mean? Like this guy, like there's all those, like, it's not that systematic, but it is the same. That's the pot stirring mechanism, right? That pot stirring mechanism that can rattle you out of the flow state in real time, and if you are really solid on, the parameter that you're working with, you'll never get rattled out of the flow state, because you're not even trying to keep the form is keeping you at that point. But to get to that point, that's where we get solid on those fundamental, those grips, like back to the whole freaking actual reality. We just get solid on the triad grips and identify those 6 triadic configurations for each possible chord, right? That's like, it's not that is going to be the only thing we ever think about. It's just like, that is the first level of understanding the toolkit of surviving the form displacements of real-time improvisation, which are your own, right? I'm trying to get that point of like, you also are doing it to yourself, right? So when you play by yourself, right, or in your own compositional, if you're playing with your DAW or whatever, right, like you're playing with your own personal feedback loop, unaccompanied, if you will. You're creating your own feedback loop, right? You're creating your own flow state based on like the call and response between yourself, right? Play one thing, play something else, right? If you make a mistake, right, in your thought process, like you're like, oh, I didn't mean to play that, right? If you have that thing, the instant millisecond thought becomes, oh, but I hear where it fit. it's perfect. Now I can just nail that one down even deeper, right? Like, didn't mean to play that, but the implication of that thing that I didn't mean to play, that's actually going to give me the next idea, which is then going to reinforce that thing that I didn't mean to play and then make it seem like I meant to play everything. And now you've transcended, you didn't mean to play or didn't not mean to play. It's always just seeing how everything fits into a form and corroborating it with each sequential thing that you do.
I have something to add. For somebody who is like a musician who never maybe improvised or has very little experience with it, I think it starts in the practice room, and you have to give yourself that feedback, and you have to you have to sound bad. You have to you have to experiment. You have to eventually you will hit some new models and stuff that okay, maybe I can try this, and maybe or accidentally something happens and okay, this sounds bad. It doesn't mean that you suck or whatever. It just means that you're exercising this muscle, which eventually will start flowing into no, into what you actually want to express. And more, this you can surprise yourself also from that, and within context of a group or something in a genre or something like that, it's much more difficult because you have to have some kind of language that other people speak with, you can speak with in real
Yeah, and
time.
that
But
language right there, that's where I bring out the form. That's the form, right? Like, what's the thing that
yeah,
connects
but
the musicians?
what I would like to tell is that I see that this musical fluency has like two ends of the spectrum, like the two abstract ultimates. One is the, surviving, which you already mentioned, which is like having some kind of model on which you can rely that you can play with people in the first place, and
Mm-hmm.
start like exploring and, you know, uh, whatever it takes. But maybe it takes learning circle of fifths, maybe it takes to learn the fretboard, different
Whatever it takes.
tonalities, whatever chord changes, chord progressions, form, song structure, whatever it means,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a rhythm even or whatever. And the second thing is that yes, you have some kind of, I don't know, like ungodly mastery, like Alan Holdsworth or somebody who has circumvented the whole thing his own way, and just yeah, nobody can really understand what and how he does things, just to speculate on whatever he's playing, yeah.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I like that. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, every time Holdsworth comes up, it comes up so freaking often, right? Because it's such a phenomenon, like the Holdsworthian phenomenon. But I think like with Holdsworth, we what we really learn, and this is like based on a couple of specific resources have taught me. One is the Alan Holdsworth instructional video, which is absolutely legendary. So it's just so it's like funny. It's just too good. It's so good. But then one of the other deepest cut resources I've ever found is that guy who made that 5 hour comprehensive Holdsworth thing. That is the best. Oh my god, that is so good. But between those two things, um, I feel like one of the lessons we get from Holdsworth is this idea of like he's really, really, really clear on his pathways, and then on a deeper level, it's just grips. He's just really clear on like pathway grip mentality, and that's why he circumvented the whole thing, like you're saying, Armin. Of course, he circumvented it. And what we can learn is we should all circumvent it, but we can also use like more or less traditional theory. And by that, I just mean like the 12 tone system in the conventional way, not the Holdsworthian way. Because Holdsworth used the 12 tone system, obviously, but he just didn't say like C, D, E, right? It was a different language, but it's just like, okay, 12 tone system. It can definitely help to use like the traditional thing of it and then start to see like those resonant structures that we kind of already know are resonant versus like Holdsworth, right? And he tells a story like when he was like a kid, he was like really young, starting to think about stuff. He was just looking at the piano and just like doing like, oh, combinations, like systematic combinations. If you're like 12, you have time for that, right? And you know what I mean? But like when you're like older and you're wanting to get that comprehensive harmonic awareness, it makes sense to just go right to those like first principles, those triad grips, and then just see how far those take you, basically. Because if you only work with those and then see how far you can get, then you have an understanding of where scales can go and where not even scales, where tetrachords, where pentatonics, and then eventually where scales can go. But you see so much power in just like those first principle fundamentals. But that's going to give you a framework to use that then will go Holdsworthian circumvention. And so I encourage everyone to go Holdsworthian circumvention. I just think the path starts by seeing how to make like really potent music with those resonant structures, which we see are the triads.
Yes, and I wanted to add, it has to be like the beginning has to be cost efficient. It cannot, I think there is a very good correlation between learning a lot of theory and then having reduced and exponentially reduced chances of actually implementing any of that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's just having some kind of very simplified base system and building on that is just, I think, what will make the difference for somebody who is like trying to learn this as a speed run, basically, to,
Yeah,
play with people
which
and
is
stuff.
lots of people, right? Right? That's what you're driving. Exactly, man. You said it. You said it, right? Like cost efficiency in that whole thing is like, that's why it's like, okay, like you don't have to do what Holdsworth did to be able to understand music like he understands it. Like, welcome to the future, like we're the one place we can literally see like human evolution, right? Is in that like technical development sphere. Like, how fast can we develop techniques, man? You said it. It's like, now we really understand, like, and it's like now, man, I think they understood this maybe already like 300 years ago, but we definitely understand how to like make resonant music, in 2025, like anyone can figure it out, right? But it's like, yeah, there's a cost efficient roadmap, and most people unfortunately don't have that roadmap by a long shot, and they're lost in nightmare land. But you're starting to see, the same thing I see is just like, well, if you have that thing that gives you that feedback flow thing, right? That gets you deeper in that flow state. Like, how do we get the flow state? How do we experience the flow state? So once we identify it, then we can just build on that. We've identified it, right? One, killing the inner critic. Number freaking one. And then it's just like, okay, how do you kill that inner critic? You literally lay the bulletproof foundations, which we've identified as triadic configurations, understand those through a single form. You now have the makings of the flow state that you can reliably enter. And I'm saying this based on literal, like, talking to a lot of the students here, right? That's like, I didn't start with that method specifically, but I simplified until I got to a point where people are like, I understand everything over a 2-measure harmonic sequence, right? So that to me is where that's where I'm getting the conviction to kind of see it from that perspective. What do you got?
Okay, next thing I would like to focus on probably is the problem of saturation. What I mean by that is, for example, you have a system, which is the system, for example, that somebody uses, or they don't have this harmonic like system, and they play something, and it sounds like exactly the same. They have the same licks, the same library, and they cannot seem to be more frustrated to develop something that else, or somebody who has some kind of system or time or has a lot of experience, and he has developed something that has a lot of components, is very expressive, very rhythmic, very interesting, very maybe arrangement helps or whatever. But the thing is that, yes, we come back to the topic of, okay, how do I actually improve the, of course, it's within the context of the genre. In jazz it would be very different than, for example, in like a Meshuggah style of music or whatever. But there here, like expression, different techniques of viewing the instrument or your like theory or whatever in a different like with like senses, different senses, and only choosing to some few creative decisions, putting some creative limitations, to squeeze something interesting out, and yeah, a lot of those things. If you refine, for example, I will play some kind of phrase and then I have to hold on for one note for like, I don't know, 2 seconds, and I will just try for different notes and I understand, okay, I have an amazing lick right now, or, whatever,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, you're talking
stuff like
about
that.
the levels of parameters. Exactly. Yeah, because that's what I'm bringing to it is just like, okay, so then welcome to the world of parameters, right? So it's like, okay, now you understand that parameters are actually going to be the thing that unlocks the limitless creative awareness. It's going to be realized through parameters. Then the question becomes, well, like, what the hell are parameters, right? And you got a whole, you just said a bunch of really good stuff. It's like, well, like for example, a rhythmic parameter where like you want to land the last note of your phrase on a certain note. Well, that's a harmonic, but also on a certain rhythm with a certain duration. So whatever, one note, one duration, right? You have to think of time and space at the same time. But that would be like one aspect of a parameter. But then the deepest fundamental parameter would then be using just the resonant structures within the 12 tone system and systematically understanding that. That's obviously a parameter that holds so much water, where then you go and do like a parameter like you just said, right? Those more like um just almost like more, I don't want to say random, but almost like, you can have random parameters. And I talk to some great composers about this all the time. Yeah, I'll bring this out as a side note. This is you guys know that guy God? Yeah, I think you know God, Armin, right? Um,
I maybe, is it the SoundCloud sphere that you're referring to?
he's a Bandcamp guy. He's an epic Bandcamp. He's made like six
Maybe,
albums. Yeah.
maybe not. I don't know.
It's
Okay.
so
Yeah.
hilarious trying to share his music with anybody. You got to
Yeah.
check out God.
Okay.
What,
Yeah.
what are you telling me right now?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, his whole phenomenon, but yeah, he's just a guy he's made 6 albums so far, and they're all like biblical, and they're like technical death metal. I would describe it as technical death metal. Um, and I talked to that guy about his creative process, man. And this guy's got these macro parameters. Talk about random. Obviously, it's not random, but like it's just like, whoa, like that is out to lunch. But I understand like what he's driving at with his macro parameters. Like it's kind of like what you were saying, Armin, the other day about you think of like intro or like intro variation, ambient variation, riff, right? So, like that's kind of God, except for God is thinking it in terms of like an entire album, and he's talking about things like you just said, where like slides, for example, hammer-ons from nowhere, or
Yes,
example,
yes,
string skipping arpeggios, like you know what I mean? Like the levels
yes.
of parameters go really deep to the point where if you don't already have that fundamental like parameter understanding of like, well, what about like harmonic basic? What's the basic parameter of harmony? Then you're kind of lost in that whole potentiality right there. So everyone's got to get that reference point. And I think with the Holdsworthian story, the thing that always comes back is like, in the case of Holdsworth, he didn't do that through the traditional way that we think about it. But
Yeah, but I would like to tell that he still had different parameters. He used legato, he used syntax, he used, this guitar like that.
absolutely.
He had a specific technique, and still he had also those parameters.
Oh no, yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. And I mean to say he definitely had a set of parameters, and that's what you learn in this instructional video. You understand the way that he thinks about, he definitely had them. But what I wanted to say is like you don't have to see it from the traditional, triadic grip thing. You
yes.
don't have to. You can get to any level without any one specific, fundamental reference point of parameters. However, back to the idea of like, well, what's the one that's going to work the fastest and has the most like fundamental coherent logic? It's probably going to be your like cycle of force, triadic voice leading, that whole logic, right? Because the whole thing is, if you understand how that works right away, well, then now you're kind of reverse engineering that as a result, and you're able to imply harmony as like a embedded technique. Versus like with Holdsworth, he wasn't necessarily thinking about, like traditional harmony in the same way. I think at first he was actually thinking about organizing the fretboard with all the intervals that resonate with a certain chord change, and then literally like a button in his mind, switch the entire fretboard to then represent another harmonic, and then just switch them according to the harmonic rhythms. I'm pretty sure that's how he thinks about it. So because I talked to some people about this actually, a lot of guitarists who understand that exact thing that I just described, but their problem is that they don't know how to do what Holdsworth figured out, which is to switch the whole fretboard like on a dime, like 2 beats of this fretboard configuration. Now it's entirely reconfigured. But like we just do
Yes.
that through triads. He did it through the whole fretboard.
Of course, I like even though I don't know what exactly he did, but the thing is,
Mm,
it took a lot of what like it's a big body of work.
big body,
So
yeah.
he took something very basic and just look at a completely different way, and of course, it's in a little bit different direction than, for example, what Bach or something somebody thought, when he did the circle of fifths or whatever. So,
Exactly.
yeah. And actually why the circle of fifths and what you mentioned is more efficient thing to learn because most of the music is written in that. So yeah, that's why
Yep.
you will get more success to the music and people who already have some kind of education and so the whole jazz community will be,
You got it. Yeah, you can
yeah,
speak
with you,
music
for
with people.
example.
Yep. What do you got, Jerome?
You just completely like that whole fretboard thing with what Alan Holdsworth did just went completely over my head.
Let's talk about
Can you?
that then. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's perfect. Because it's a really, dude, this will corroborate everything we've been talking about. It's just like an alien perspective on the same exact shit we've been talking about, man. It's like, okay, I want to really, dude, this is a very weird thing to describe. In the fact that it went over your head, that implies that okay, this requires more language precision. But I have been talking about this idea with a few different people. Okay, so the fretboard guitarists who think about fretboard and Holdsworth and stuff. Holdsworth is like the best example of what I'm describing, basically, which is why we should see the value in this approach. So fretboard Holdsworth took fretboard geometry to the level that he literally wrote out diagrams of the fretboard from the whole range of the fretboard, right? So, and this is in the video. Like I'm remembering this, I think pretty accurately. Is he is saying, okay, so there's this harmony, right? It's like this, and I remember like it's like a D with a circle around it or something. Because I think it's like literally is the note D. So it's like, okay, if there's the D with the circle around it, that means that the fretboard is configured in this way. The entire fretboard is mapped out according to D with the circle, which actually I remember that he was referring to freaking Dorian. He's referring to Dorian. So the first example that he gives is that he maps out Dorian, D Dorian, on the entire fretboard, and he literally sees it like buttons. Literally, I think he thinks about buttons because that's the way he plays too. So it's like he presses the button, and it's corroborated by like his whole thing where he's saying, well, like I wanted to play the saxophone, like it made more sense. So he just turned guitar into the saxophone, and he just turned the fingering configurations of the fretboard into just like buttons that you press to imply the harmony, right? And of course, they're supported by his rhythmic sensibilities. Okay, so that's for one chord change, right? And now you're going to understand it. If you already understand that, this next part's going to make sense. So, well, what happens when it goes from, say, D Dorian to, say, B Mick, no, B Lydian, B Lydian, D Dorian to B Lydian? What happens then? Now, instantly, as that harmonic rhythm takes shape, because that's like a Holdsworth, I'm purposely saying like a Holdsworth change. Makes no logical harmonic circle of four sense. D Dorian to B, what does that even, why? It's Holdsworth. I mean, and I transcribed, dude, I literally have charts. I literally transcribed a lot of his music, so I kind of understand his harmonic vocabulary in terms of like, it's like fast modal or something. I don't know. Anyway, so when the harmonic rhythm shifts the chord, right, the entire fretboard configuration instantly shifts. So now you're understanding a few levels of deep efficiency of mentality, very, very deep efficiency of mentality. Like the genius of Holdsworth is like, dude, it's beyond, right? He literally was like very unique in how fucking smart he was. So what you start to consider is that to do that, what I just described, right? That process of that harmonic rhythm, entire fretboard like a button, harmonic rhythm moves over, the entire reconfiguration happens. That is extremely hard to think to do, right? Like what? That's like insane. Like try to teach a guitar player that who's never like understood like fretboard geometry.
Hmm.
You'd have to teach it to them when they're like 4 years old because that's the only way they're going to understand it. You're not going to get them to
Hmm.
understand it after they're like 20. What do you got, Armin?
Uh, maybe I can add. So
Yeah.
basically, well, how music is taught usually is that you had somebody gives you, okay, this is a D, like a minor arpeggio,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
D
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
minor seventh arpeggio. Okay, and this is the gauge system, and this is how you think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't look anywhere else, and you just,
Yes.
but
Yes.
through various models like circle of fifths or whatever we are like learning how harmony relates to itself, in
Mm-hmm.
different ways. But Holzworth didn't like go through that route.
Right.
He just, had the basic parameter of some kind of, this D at a X scale or whatever
Yeah.
from the picture you sent, and he just immediately thought like, okay, I'm going to take for example, like this major scale or whatever, and I'm just going to shape this fretboard, and I'm going to think about certain chord tones or whatever. And he just and like starts to think differently about how to apply it. And basically, I think that's just his empirical nuances that allow him to like have this flexibility that he hasn't have to go through this circle fifths or whatever. At least that's what I think.
Yeah.
If you will play guitar, maybe it would be more I don't know, sensible because in the guitar fretboard you can like play multiple unisons or octaves, like uh, like a five or whatever, 5 or 6, I think, per 12 frets or something like that. So there's like different kind of intervals, in different positions you can access, and therefore you can like create different like fingerings and skip some strings and stuff.
Yep.
And basically, I think that's how he like
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
somehow
I
he
think when
made it
you
very efficient to himself.
definitely, definitely, I think when you look at the diagram, it starts to make so much sense, right? And you start to see like the Holdsworthian subversion. It's like, for example, what jumps out, and this is like if you watch this entire Holdsworth lesson, it's gonna make sense why I already kind of jump. It already kind of jumps out at me. Is that like, for example, right here, between like fret 9 and 11, right? This is like Holdsworthian. Like he's like, oh, dude, I'm gonna go insane on this pattern. Like he's just doing every combination. This one's the easiest one, and then he finds that same pattern on every key change, and that's what I was trying to get to. This is where like nuts, dude. Is that so like I was saying about like if you tried to say do this mentality on like a jazz standard or like learn all your jazz standards, you'll just get nowhere. You'll just get nowhere. It's just too insane. It's just too much things. You have to memorize the entire freaking fretboard, like how that interchanges. Like that's just too many things. Because compare that to just understanding the 6 triad grips and how those connect. It's like, oh, but what Holdsworth did was the way that he wrote tunes, he just wrote tunes as practice parameters. He created forms as practice parameters for his psycho fretboard game shift, like gear shift. Better word would be gear shift. He writes the
Yeah.
form and then specifically practices the fretboard shifts according to that form and focuses all his energy right there instead of trying to apply that fretboard shifting to like, 10 songs over the course of like, like a couple of days or something. It's like, nope, one form. I'm going to just master that form with my fretboard shifting technique. It
So
implies
yeah,
a
just
ton about the 12-tone system.
in short, yeah. For example, if we would like look, okay, here is the Ionian, here is the Dorian of that scale, here is the Phrygian, and
Yeah.
try to, okay, we always start from the root note on the like first string, use the lowest string, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and we have this kind of this flexibility,
Yep.
and we have to practice to get a lot of like to see basically the fretboard, and what I assume Holdsworth was very efficient at seeing this,
Yeah.
and just to like utilize it basically in every key, and that's what I think
Yep.
made it so accessible. No, not
Mm.
that's why he was so expressive in this
Yes,
variety, because it was so
exactly.
accessible to him. Yeah, I think
I think that's
that's what we are trying
exactly,
to say. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. That's exactly the best point is like, why is he so expressive in his playing? It's because of that way of thinking about the fretboard where he just found out a way to identify the harmonic rhythms according to like the guitar geometry shift of like button pressing, and he's just respecting harmonic rhythms, but he sees such possibility with each one. And I think like the nuance of his approach would just be that he's playing a lot of the same licks. Okay, so that's counterintuitive to a lot of people. I know that because that 5 hour comprehensive video, that's basically the thesis statement of that video. The guy's thesis statement is like Holdsworth is actually playing like a lot of the same licks, but that's the keys to understanding everything, is because he's identifying a few levels of um, efficacy, convenience, technique, melodicism, harmony. He's identifying a few levels of like, here are the favorable ones, right? Because the whole thing is like not all patterns are created equal. And the way that Holdsworth teaches his approach to tonal system is he almost makes it seem like he does think all patterns are created equal. But then when you actually get into his music, you realize that's not what his music reflects. His music reflects that he has a certain harmonic mentality that he comes back to, and that's like the potency of like the Holdsworthian language. It's not as expressive as it is rhythmically and like lyrically and melodically. It's still rooted in like a very specific harmonic mentality, which is kind of a byproduct of unlocking the fretboard in the specific way that he unlocked it. So depending on how you unlock the fretboard, you're going to have a certain harmonic inclination. And what I start to see is with people who understand grips, they all have a different inclination with the grips, right? But it's still the same parameters, and a lot of people can understand it very quickly, but you're going to apply, everyone's applying it in a way that they're favoring certain aspects of it. It's just like inevitable. It's like those are things that we want to just notice, and as we build out our vocabulary, we can always acknowledge, oh, like I sort of favor this sort of thing. Like tetrachords, for example, I always come back to that. Certain specific tetrachords. Jerome, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like you're already identifying like certain favorable things. And from a trumpet perspective, I mean, you have a lot of value to add. I mean, like I mean, I'd love to hear like just first of all, do you understand that Holdsworth thing? That first one over your head, do you understand it now?
Yeah, it's just sort of insane.
Yeah,
Like the fact that analogy, like the gear shifting. It's like,
yeah.
okay, I'm shifting, and but I feel like that's the trap I run into when I think of scales, because
Mm,
I know what notes I have to pick, but
mm,
then shifting from scale to scale,
yep.
or or no, it's tricky on a trumpet as well, because it's like it's not like a button I can press. Like my
Mm,
buttons that I physically press can literally create its own series of notes
yep.
that may or may not be in whatever, like scale system that I want to work with.
Exactly. Exactly. No, I know. And now you start to see, yeah, like kind of the power of the guitar. It's quite a hack. It's quite a hack. But the challenge of, any instrument, including guitar, but like we just identify guitar. It's you can understand harmony just because of the way that the fretboard is just showing you the whole thing. It's very like open and visual compared to say a horn, trumpet, saxophone, trombone, where it's all inside a thing, and the buttons, for example, like the valves, it doesn't reflect like some innate geometry, you know. So it makes your job as a horn player to really unlock fluency. I would say that it's going to be less intuitive to you because unless somebody's already kind of exposed you to the idea of intervallic geometry, it's never really going to come up. You're always going to think of the staff and you're going to think of like those kinds of relationships, which they teach you to. I mean, like when I went to music theory and all that, they teach you to think of that way. But as we already know from literal, many decades of music pedagogy, that people who understand the standard notation staff interval thing, 90% of them are not fluent in music. So it starts to become the lessons of Holdsworth. I mean, that's kind of what I'm telling you here, because even before I even understood Holdsworth, back when it just scared me and I couldn't even listen to it because it just scared me too much, I was already thinking about intervallic fretboard geometry. And to the point where, like, when I was in high school, I was teaching people like the music theory print lessons that we had to learn for like literal AP music theory from just teaching them fretboard. I was like, well, just remember the major sixth is that shape. And it's just like, just think about the fretboard, you know, like use that shape. And it was easier for them to do that on the guitar than it was the piano, because in the piano, the major sixth shape is not always like, it's not the same distance exactly. It's a different thing, right? It's still like, well, it's the same amount of notes in between, yes, but the way that looks on the keyboard is, it's not a consistent geometric thing. Versus on the guitar, like one chord shape, like the open major, right? This is where it counts for you, Jerome. You see what I'm saying, is like the open root position major triad is the same shape across that whole string set in every key. If a horn player can understand intervallic geometry that way, they freaking crack the code. And I would say that the reason a lot of the traditional, when I say traditional, I mean the people who learn from the traditional way and then like unlocked it and became like psycho geniuses, like Chris Potter, for example, or like Mark Turner, or people like this. It's because they started learning that shit really, really, really young. They started to learn like piano interval, sequencing, like, when they were like 5 years old or something like that. But it's much, it becomes harder to understand like the counterintuitive nature of intervallic sequencing the older you get, because it's not like the 12 tone system is like, half step between B and C, half step between E and F, and then that throws off everything. I mean, how many freaking times, have I talked to, this is the classic thing. But if you just break away from that and you just start to understand equivalent symmetry of intervallic 12 tone systems, Holdsworthian, mentality, that's where you crack the code. And I would say that horn players fully, who have like reached absolute unequivocal fluency, they're really adopting a Holdsworthian mentality with how they see intervals. They're not thinking about it from like my half step, whole step scale. They're literally just being like, okay, so across the 12 tone spectrum here, I got all these buttons I can press to get that specific harmonic sequence, or that harmonic resonance. Like that structure is represented by these buttons. It's like the grips of those buttons, and then understanding how to just improvise within those grips and then compound it by going through a form and improvising with it. Intervallic geometry. And then it's like, okay, the dollars to donuts, rubber meets the road, brass tacks is the 6 configurations of any given triad. And there we go. That's where if you get like, that's your first tool. And you understand Holdsworth if you understand that. It's just like, will you allow yourself to understand Holdsworth? Like, who's the most insane improviser? Holdsworth is top 5. I mean, Christ. I think the other 5 are, or the other 4 are probably horn players. I don't know though. That's not. It's hard to say. I mean, because like, so for example, like say like Lenny Breau or Joe Pass, they're really good improvisers because they can play tons of epic chord melody and everything like that. But I would say that the Holdsworthian vocabulary maybe is potentially even more expansive, although he doesn't play like chord melodies in the same way. It's different. Um, but anyway, I just consider that like an expressive, expansive vocabulary is usually the result of sort of like reconsidering the 12 tone system from a perspective of like parallel grip sequences, and start to see like, don't look at the half steps between the B and the C and the E and the F, ignore that stuff, and just start to see like 1-5-3, and that shape is always the same, it's always the same combinations of I mean, it's literally true. That's literally the actual science of the truth. It is literally is like that. So the ABC bullshit of the note naming system, that thing is broken, right? So if you just like, you think Alan Holdsworth cared about that, he's like, dude, no, I'm looking at all these like epic symmetries and I'm just like juggling up the notes, and I know that these intervallic sequences imply this specific harmony, and for this amount of time I can do those ones. But then because I wrote the form, I got to go over here. Now I shift the entire thing, gear shifted. And what's great about Holdsworth, think about the voice leading implications of that. Think about the voice leading implications. He's voice leading anywhere on the fretboard. The entire fretboard is a voice leading. Like gear shifted. I'm in the same location as I was, and now it's all new grips. Randomizer. And so that's where I'm saying I think Holdsworth had all of that. So I think he was thinking about all that, dude. I think he was thinking about chord changes. It's like randomizers. Man, this is gonna be good. I'm gonna go deeper on this because I have some Holdsworth charts and they just reinforce what I'm saying. But that will be for another lesson today. I think we can wrap it up here because I'm gonna write a whole. This was so much. I don't want to like give myself too much to think about. I'm gonna write so. This is mentality of musical fluency. This is mentality of musical fluency. Do you guys agree?
Yeah, but I think rhythm is also something that deserves its own topic, I think.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So we can say that this is
yeah.
mentality of musical fluency, part one, harmony or harmony, and then there's mentality of
Yes,
musical
yes.
fluency, part two, rhythm. But I think what today what we talked about was just like intervallic 12-tone system mentality, you know?
Yeah, I think I would divide those in at least three. I
Mm,
see, of course, harmony, rhythm. I think those both are the most accessible and the easiest to like talk
definitely.
about, and they will bring the most results. And then is the other aspects, depending on what your instrument you play, what genre you're playing, what in what setting you're playing, what techniques you know, what techniques you can utilize, what parameters you can utilize, and so on, and these kind of things.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. The parameters getting deeper, right? And we're just kind of creating that reference point for how parameters really show up in creation. But yeah, acknowledging it gets infinite for sure. I mean, it gets highly specific. But yeah, that's why it's like we'll save that stuff for another day. But this is great. This is good stuff to write on. Mentality of musical fluency, harmony. That's what it is. All right, good. I'll stop that.